Hello, hello. Can you hear me? How is everyone tonight? Having a good time? Am I speaking to myself? Is the thing working? Hello. Luke, I am your father. Am I speaking to myself? Did everyone leave? That might have happened. We have been away for a little bit. Don't not go. Someone say something. Chat, are you there? Yeah, I had to take a little mental health break. It's been a rough couple weeks, huh? A lot of stuff went down. Why do I have a feeling everything is frozen? Nope, no one's here. Okay. Well, it's been a rough couple weeks. A lot of stuff went down. We have kind of sat quiet for a little bit, and that's my fault. The trick of it is it's kind of difficult. Election season is rough, right? You see a lot of people with a lot of stupid ideas. On both sides, to be fair. So you get a little exhausted after a while. And I'll be honest, it gets to me for a little bit. You see a lot of people with a lot of stupid ideas talking about things like, oh yeah, Kamala Harris decided to leave. Tim Walz is lying about his rank, blah, 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 blah. JD Vance is screwing a couch, which is funny, to be perfectly fair, but still not necessarily true and pervades the discussion in ways that disallow people from engaging on issues. But one of these ideas I've seen crop up lately that is weird to me, like really weird, is this concept that you don't have to participate in politics, and that by somehow not participating in the political processes of your country, particularly in those countries in which you have the option to do so, you are sending a message, or to quote certain unfortunately named South American savory pastries, conditioning your vote. And this is an interesting thought to me. So the argument goes that if you don't vote for the Democratic Party, it will tell them that you disapprove of their actions in regards to handling of Israel and Gaza. And that's an interesting thing to me. Because one of the most basic things you learn about democracy, if you participate in any level whatsoever, is that decisions are made by those who show up. Oh, there are people in chat. Hi, chat. Can you hear me, chat? Let me know if I'm audible. Decisions are made by people who show up. So what does that really mean? On a basic level, at the most simplest, idealistic level, if you vote, your voice is heard. But it means more than that, right? There's two levels. There's two levels of this that's happening, right? The first is if you show up and vote, your voice is heard, and that's true. Suppose you have a pool of 50 voters, but only 10 of them are voting. The surest path to victory for a campaign at that point is to get 6 of those 10 to vote for them. The other 40 are irrelevant on a basic level. So, like, if the objective is to change policy, you need to be able to get yourself in a position to have your views heard. So, apart from being the 6 of the 10, what being politically active really gets down to is being able to generate votes. If I can go to you as an organization and say, I want your support, can you phone Mank and Canvas for me? There are a lot of organizations that can do this. It's fairly cost effective. It's fairly easy to do. What it does is it buys you the opportunity to put your issues before the campaign if they win. And that's important because it's a level beyond voting, right? Because you're able to provide a campaign something they want, which is voter participation and voter mobilization, you're able to bring to them issues. Unions do this, not as nearly as effectively as corporations in some levels, but unions do this in order to build political profile and build a base of support. These things make it so that your objective as a active participant in democracy is allowed. It can flourish, it can grow. So if the objective is to get the Democratic Party to change its stance on Israel and Gaza and Palestine generally, the key is not to hide away. The key is to get out there and participate. It's to bring them there. Make yourself an undeniable force. Particularly because the flip side of this is that you have a Republican Party that gives no flying fuck about you to begin with, and will give even less of a fuck about the issues that you want to see done and enacted, and won't do anything for those things. So I understand that there are a lot of people who get upset about the concept of a two-party system and a duopoly and all that nonsense. But you live in the system you live in, and you participate in where you're at. Those are how you make the world turn. I right out of high school, I started working a engineering job, a audio and sound engineering equipment job, and I would hook up telephones and camera, whatnot. One of those jobs was at a police station, and the police station was getting a upgrade because they were going. 911 centers used to basically be a huge ass console that was full of manual buttons. And at the time, and this was like 2007, 2008, at the time, touchscreens were fairly new and neat technology, and they were getting these installed. So one of the other things they put in was a computer flooring. On the floor, you pop out a panel, and you can run wires underneath it. This particular station I was working at was used electrical relays to control various doors. So you could hit a button from the station, 911 center, and would open like the garage door for the police station or a cell door, etc. Obviously, you want these things to work properly. If you hit the button for the garage door and the cell opens, you might let out a incarcerated individual. So you don't want that to happen. So I'm sitting there rewiring these electrical relays to the new system and taking my time. And you have this, my boss at the time, he's like, taking my time doing it right, double checking each relay to make sure I got it done. Because the building was screwed up. That's a whole different story. Here's the thing. He's like, this is taking too long. It's like you're masturbating with boxing gloves. Work sites are fun like that, kids. And he's like, yeah, it'll take too long. You might get it done, but there's a lot easier ways to do it. The concept of conditioning your vote on having someone doing what you want is good, but you have to be in that pool of voters to begin with. You have to be in that pool of participants to begin with. Getting up on Twitter and saying, I'm not going to vote for the Democrats because they are just as bad on Gaza as the Republicans isn't conditioning your vote. It's masturbating with boxing gloves. Getting up on YouTube and doing that, especially if you're from frickin' Argentina, isn't conditioning your vote. It's doing it. It's masturbating with boxing gloves. Here's the thing. Decisions are made by those who show up, and decisions are made by those who get organized. So what we've talked about in the past, back both on the panel last month and when Brooks came on before, is that it's important to participate in the process at every level. And we see how effective this is because we have watched for decades as Republicans have ran for every little nook and cranny school board, dog catcher position they can get. And they have now been able to dictate policies on a granular level for everyday Americans that are sometimes insane. You know, one of the things I saw this weekend, or this week rather, and a story on MSNBC. I was listening in the morning on my way to dialysis. It's people who have alien registration numbers, or in other words, people who were in this country and became citizens and had an ID that was a non-citizen ID beforehand, are getting their voter registrations deactivated in Alabama, in places like Alabama and Texas. Why do you think it's so important to Republicans that certain people do not vote? Because it's effective. Because participation matters and is effective. They don't want these people to vote. They want to discourage them from voting. And in fact, it sounds like it has discouraged a lot of people from voting this year. These are people who became citizens who are now eligible to vote. Who went through a process, by the way, that most Americans don't. Most Americans who are here by birthright citizenship never actually have to explore much of what America means outside of maybe taking a civics class in high school. These are people who take a test, a long test, by the way, where they're asked about the system of government that they want to join, and they're asked about American history, and they're asked about all these things that most Americans take for granted. I get discouraged when I see people saying they don't want to participate. I get discouraged when they say there's nothing they can do. When they decide that the system is so corrupt that the only pure action is to sit outside of it. Because all you're doing at that point is masturbating with boxing gloves. It doesn't make the world a better place. It doesn't get things done. And it's one of those things. I've been sitting watching these last couple of weeks. I had to step away. I was hitting a wall, right? I'm sitting there. I got 2 video essays, one due for a patron and one due because it's important on a political level. And I was hitting a wall. I couldn't do the research for them. Every time I pick up the book, I just kind of like into myself and stop reading. And I realized that what had happened is I was mentally at my limit. There's kind of like this little cup you put in there for bullshit, and a lot of people are really good at walking away from it. But once the cup fills up and spilleth over, there's no more you can put in there. And I see so many people making horrifyingly bad and destructive arguments that allow them to turn around and justify doing horrible things to one another. You see it on Israel Palestine, you see it in Ukraine, you see it from Russians, you see it everywhere these days. It feels like it's just oppressive. And I know that's not how the world is because I go out and I talk to people. It's just dialysis patients. I talk to other dialysis patients. And none of them care. And to be fair, they have more pressing things going on. But to a certain extent, I have to remind myself that the world is not cruelty, and not all people being cruel to one another. That's, important, right? It's important to step back for a little bit. I've taken some time. I've not read anything, productive. I've not read anything like productive. Like I haven't been looking at, history books or anything like that for a little bit. I have been rereading the Star Wars X-Wing series, and if you've talked to me in the last couple of weeks, you know that I have been replaying the TIE Fighter conversion mod or actually playing for the first time since they redid it, the TIE Fighter conversion mod for X-Wing Alliance, all 20-year-old games. So I haven't really done much that's productive, and it's time to get back in the swing of things. Hetman sent me a message this week about like, oh yeah, here's this thing where they interview What If Autist, and he's called a historian. It's a historian predicts there's a civil war, and I just want to tie up What If Autist and Tim Pool in a room and see which one makes the other one's ears bleed first. Come on, laugh. That was a little funny. We're not getting into a civil war, by the way. That's silly. But for this evening, I thought we'd look at a recent What If Autist video. Boop. It says boop. Here. Here. We probably need to get an overlay. Make Sunday happy. And I'll tell you what, it's no one's fault. I'll tell you what, though. It's no one's fault, but I had 5 conversations with 5 different people last night, some of which were very dire. I almost canceled stream, and then I saw this damn video and thought, well, I'm going to yell at What If Autist for a while and make myself feel better. So let us go. Let's see. Let's take some bets. Just type everything right in the poll, Jesus. Let's take some bets. Will What If Autist project his lonely incel life onto everyone? On the video that says, stop coping, your life sucks.
If you realized how little you knew about yourself, you would be in complete shock. All knowing comes from comparison. You only truly know who you are.
Oh, God. All knowing comes from comparison? Of what? Of what, Rudyard? This is not going to go well.
Are until you know what you're not. Our era of history does so much evil through purposely obfuscating who we are comparing ourselves to. We judge everything through the eye of utopia or the best possible option rather than comparing ourselves to other eras of real history. Once you control the frame, you control literally everything. We will circle back to this point as it will gradually make more sense later. With all that being said, the thesis of this video is that your life is vastly harder than you imagine. We will go through the life of the average What If.
This is already horrible. How do you suspect you're going to get that away with that, Rudyard? Your life is horrible. You don't know that. You don't know who's watching your videos. This is, at best, an overgeneralization.
defaultist fan to show how their life is actually incredibly difficult. I think people are really suffering now and are in serious denial about it. The human mind's capability for denial or coping is enormous, and I think we are all coping as individuals right now. In fact, I think we are the era of history which is coping the most ever, as I will explain later. This video will go through every aspect of an average person's life, whether they're economic, social, spiritual, physical, and other aspects, to show that normal young people live terrible lives holistically. This will upend a lot of assumptions that people have built their own personal lives on, that modernity is objectively superior to every other era of history. The difference between mental stability and madness is a handful of intellectual pillars that hold up your world. What happens when those pillars have rotted through? The short answer is that our comprehension of the world and the human condition is simply not accurate. According to SAW, an acronym I invented for Studies and
SAW, Studies and Ancient Wisdom, shows that the convergence. How does an acronym show that the convergence of anything in the 21st century is found in traditional folkways, what in world cultures have existed for millennia? This is.
ancient wisdom, which I will explain later, is the convergence between what ancient folkways and world religions have taught across all of history, which very much converges with recent scientific studies in the 21st century, that human nature is not at all what the 20th century and what our background believes. Once you understand the true nature of human nature, the horror of what our society is doing is so astounding. It will leave you breathless. Major themes we'll get into. One of the major themes we'll get into with this video is that debt is a huge issue that is crushing America, with the average American having $100,000 worth of debt of a variety of kinds. Well, keep in mind, a normal American makes something around $50,000 a year.
Okay. This is probably an ad, but hang on. Median income for Americans in 2022 was $37,000 a year. But let's continue.
And debt is insane, and getting rid of debt can be insanely difficult, but with our sponsor, PDS Debt, you can find the credits to yours for debt and get out of like a game of Go. Go is a Chinese game that goes back at least 4,000 years, in which you try to surround an enemy force to wipe them out. It plays into Chinese military strategy, as famously championed by Sun Tzu, which prizes indirect tactics and fighting through omission as an explicit strategy. Although I don't think most of you would agree with this point initially, by gradually moving through all the intellectual bases, we can surround the argument. In fact, I think this is how all worldviews are constructed. We tend to view the creation of our worldview, in which our civilization is currently built off ideas like feminism, liberalism, science, or meritocracy, was created through rationalistic scientific study, that social scientists ran rigorous tests in which they steel-manned the case and looked at all the opposing options and used the results to construct a comprehensive vision of the world. The reality
No, that's not how you build a worldview. That's not how people build worldviews, by the way. The reality is that people build worldviews largely through the same processes they exist in everyday life. Here's one of those things you'll hear people talk about to those feminists. Yeah, oh, you're such a woman. You're so emotional. Blah blah blah. People are, by and large, irrespective of what they say they are people of emotion first and logic second. If a person's going to have logic override their emotions, it's going to be a rare case. Most people react to things emotionally with what they feel is right. This map is bullshit, by the way. Rather than what they can reason out. So what happens is you'll decide it feels right that I should be able to To quote someone, Brooks video recently, eat this last piece of pizza. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's right. But the justification goes from there. People justify things after the fact. The idea of social sciences, by and large, particularly things like that, is to take our assumptions and look at them and see if they're true. These aren't conscious efforts to construct ideologies. They are testing your assumptions about the world. They're looking at things like, well, we assume that people who don't eat food, sufficient nutritious food, are bad at school. Then we do tests and test that. We assume X, Y, and Z, and then we do tests and test it. The gap that What a Faultist always has is that he is unwilling to let go of his preconceptions without he won't let them be challenged. So he will look for the data that bears out his ideas and ignore all the rest.
Is the complete opposite, in which over the course of the 20th century, our worldview, based under such assumptions like men and women being the same, natural equality, the blank slate, or the noble savage, were just assumed to be correct. Anyone who disagreed with these ideas was shamed and kicked out of society. This was since it was in...
Who was kicked out of society? Like, there hasn't really been a case of people being kicked out of society for not participating in the Enlightenment. When we talk about the Enlightenment, it's not like, oh, everyone is enlightened now. These are specific things happening among specific social classes that don't necessarily, like you're sitting there in, 18th, 19th, 20th century France as a peasant farmer. You're still going to be a peasant farmer irrespective of what Voltaire is doing.
Inside the self-interest of those in power to believe these things. When we did test them in the early 21st century, we realized that they were completely incorrect. The way people build worldviews instead is that their worldview needs to make sense for the facts they know and the things that happen to them in their daily lives.
No one, no one has ever challenged that assumption. That is basically what, my worldview is based off of the things that I know and can see and can verify, insofar as my experiences. Yes, exactly. My worldview is based off of my experiences, which is why worldviews are hardly ever comprehensive, because your experiences will never be comprehensive.
Medieval Aristotelian worldview collapsed as there were too many facts that it was clear that the wise ancients were unaware of, whether the existence of the Americas, the scientific method, gunpowder, and they were very clearly wrong on stuff like the human.
The Aristotelian worldview didn't collapse because people discovered America. The Aristotelian worldview changed because it was translated over time and challenged by various scholars. It was a process. It wasn't
body or physics. Then people gradually look for a new worldview which can encompass the facts. Once the new worldview hits critical mass explanatory power, people accept it unconditionally. Once a new world...
Well, no, that's not the case either. Aristotle held sway in medieval intellectual circles for generations, irrespective of what he actually said. These are slow evolutionary processes. They change over time. They change over time. They don't just suddenly, one day, everyone starts believing a thing. That's stupid. No one does that. Like, what is this child's on about?
view hits critical explanatory power for the lives of the people in it, people will accept it unconditionally, living and breathing its assumptions. Kuhn invented this theory of history called paradigms. However, this process is in no way rational. Normally, it's accompanied by bloody wars in which the new order kills off the old. Even
The Black Death is not a war. The world wars created social justice and digital. No, they didn't. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars for industrialization and romanticism, kind of. But like mass industrialization was going to happen one way or the other after Napoleonic. And did, by and large, by the way. And industrialization isn't a worldview, it's an activity.
with irrefutable evidence, the old generations die with the old ideas. As the saying goes, science advances one grave at a time. The old order gradually dies as there are
Max Planck, science advances one funeral at a time.
too many examples of the theory not working. Like a game of Go, you gradually surround the old paradigm, with the final execution being a quiet moment, after which the theory is discredited over a long period of time, losing its vitality. The central koan, which is a concept from Zen Buddhism for a question that pondering will result in you getting the answer for this video.
No, the central concept of a koan is that you ponder it in order to reach a state of enlightenment. It doesn't actually come up with an answer. So, for example, the classic example is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You are not going to come up with the answer for what the sound of one hand clapping is. However, you can supposedly reach a higher state of being and enlightenment from thinking about this. What did they do to deserve this from you, Rudyard?
Is how is the 21st century West the wealthiest, safest, most hygienic, peaceful, best fed, and best educated society in world history, but
that's not a cone.
Its inhabitants score the worst on mental wellness tests of, again, anyone in history. The society itself suffers crippling depression, anxiety, ADHD, suicide.
That's not a cone, you little
And other mental conditions you could possibly list. This has in turn resulted in the democratically elected Western governments publicly committing suicide, either through printing infinite money, discouraging births, degrowing the industrial economy, encouraging mental illness, crime, and about a dozen other things.
Okay, let's talk about inflation, because I saw a lot of people be stupid about this in the last couple of weeks. Inflation can be caused by the printing of currency, but it's also caused by any number of other factors. For example, this increase of supply or the decrease of supply while demand goes up will cause inflation. The value of your money goes down. Inflation is unavoidable at a certain level. It's controllable to a certain extent, but unavoidable. The concept that we are printing out infinite money is silly, because we're not. How inflation has changed the price of a cup of coffee over time. That's actually, like, this is a fairly reasonable amount of inflation. You're talking like, hang on, 1970 to 2022. That's nigh on 50 years. 50 years, the price of a cup of coffee has, by and large, stayed pretty flat.
the industrial economy, encouraging mental illness, crime.
How are people being encouraged to have mental illness? You could make a very sincere case that people are not encouraged to seek help because it's not really readily available. But the problem is that that's not what government wants. It is what the market will, quote unquote, bear. Which, by the way, is another problem. Like, you're talking largely about the forces that are being affected by late-stage capitalism. And this isn't a cone or something that's difficult to answer. This isn't something you have to meditate on. This is actually a fairly self-explanatory phenomena, whereas people aren't being provided services that are not deemed as economically viable by the people who are able to sell services. It's not a mystery.
And about a dozen other things. The abbreviated version of this is, why is the wealthiest society ever also the most unhappy? This question is of the high.
Well, here's the problem. The wealthiest society ever isn't that the wealth is distributed throughout the society. So it's not like people can afford the things that wealth brings. Most of the wealth is concentrated among a very small select group of people, and it stops there. It ceases to move. The velocity of money stops. So the question isn't why is a wealthy society unhappy? It's where is the wealth being concentrated, and how does that affect people's happiness? How does that affect people's standard of living? If your standard of living is higher, you're naturally going to be happy. If you're fucking concerned that the roof over your head is going to be taken away in an eviction every month, then you're not going to be happy. You're going to be concerned about the things that confront you.
Highest importance, since nested inside it is the question that if we don't answer, will kill our society. It already is, but we don't want to know the answer yet. We'd rather commit suicide as a civilization, since the pain of letting go is so hard. The fundamental answer is that something is very, very wrong in our culture.
What is that something, Rudyard? Because something is very, very wrong isn't actually an answer. You got to get to the point, kid.
That the materialistic assumptions which underlie every thought in our culture are just wrong. Man is not nourished by wealth, but by love in his soul. Asking this question is the only...
Right, okay, but here's the problem again. Why are people separated? Particularly, let's throw out Western society, because this isn't universally true on any level, right? For example, you have countries like Europe where people are, by and large, capable of getting things like paid vacation, and they have more holidays. The average American doesn't work a 40-hour work week. Average is 34. However, 50% of full-time workers work more than 40 hours. So here's the killer, right? Your ability to find things like raise a family, have kids, those things upon which we grant social fulfillment are dependent upon two things. The first is that you have the resources available to do that. It takes money to have kids, to have a house, to do those things, to provide stability. It takes access to leisure time in order to even find someone upon which you're going to have kids with. These are things that you might not necessarily be able to afford. Americans have seen their productivity of the American worker increase dramatically over the last several decades, while their wages have remained essentially flat. The fact is that Americans don't share in the wealth that what Defaultist is claiming the most wealthy society has. They don't have access to those things. It's not that the material things and ideas, the underlying things, are wrong. It's not like the women got up and said we should have equal rights and be able to vote, that made society worse. Those weren't the things that have affected Americans' quality of life. The things that affect Americans' quality of life are quite literally those things which they use to survive. Having money is essential.
Only fighting chance our people have for survival. To start this story, let's look at the life of the average What If Altist fan. We'll look at every single aspect of their lives to gradually see what is wrong with the world today. This person is of course imaginary, but there's often greater truth in an imaginary symbol.
Which is good, because this entire video is also imaginary.
Then in the real world, given the symbol can elegantly encompass truths far more complex than anything else. Also, having met hundreds of people in this audience, the What If Altist audience is holistically better off than the general public. And I say this because it's true, not to flatter you folks, but the What If Altist audience is more psychologically stable, intelligent, educated, wealthy, and driven than the general public.
That would be because the vast majority of the What If Altist audience is watching What If Altist to make fun of him. If it's true at all, it's like, oh, they're relatively psychologically stable. Yes, because they don't believe What If Altist.
Public. If anything, this is a pretty generous look at the modern world and life today. About 95% of this audience is male, so
Totally shocked. Absolutely shocked.
our character is a man by definition, and a majority of this audience is American. Thus, our character will also be an American. Having met them, it's obvious that this audience is predominantly white, so he'll be America's most...
It's obvious. It's predominantly white. Oh dear. We're not going to go too late tonight, everybody.
common ethnic mix of British and German ancestry. The state with the most viewers in total number is California, while the most populous city in California is Los Angeles. The state with the highest per capita What If Altist fans is Missouri, but I'm going to go with total number, not per capita. Most Americans live in the suburbs, so let's put him in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Burbank. The average age for this audience is something around 25, so skewing significantly younger than the general population, and on the older side of the Zoomer generation. The average income for someone that age is around $40,000, and this audience is significantly higher income range than the general population. So let's
hang on, though. No, that's flawed already. American age is 25 to 34. The median salary is 1,000. That's a huge age range, by the way. Median salary of 20 to 24 is 706. So your median here that's making you have $50,000 is like you're selecting for 25-year-olds, but you have 9 years there, of which 4 of them are high prime earning years. So they would not be making $50,000 a year. They'd be much closer to this 36 number. In fact, it would be probably around that $36,000 number. Like, you don't understand how medians work, apparently, or age ranges.
Let's put him at $50,000 a year. Let's name him Tom Eldridge. Tom Eldridge and my...
Why does that name sound familiar? Okay.
my personal life aren't very similar. I'm just going to throw that out so you guys don't pick through his life as a way of learning about me. Eldridge is a compilation of lots of normal people I've met in my life. I'm sure there are going to be a few people in this audience who'll be saying, I am literally Tom Eldridge. Let's get into Tom's life. Part 2, Childhood. Tom Eldridge was born in 1999 in Providence St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank, California. He's born into a middle-class...
This is just a fan fiction. This is just a fan fiction.
Family in which both of his parents work. His family aren't from California and sacrificed lots of traditional ties to move out there from Indiana. He's from a loving family, but his mother fell out of love with the father, thus they divorced when he was 3 years old.
It's the mother's fault, by the way.
How half of marriages ends today, skewing older towards his Gen X parents. The father did nothing wrong, but as the protocol goes in these divorces, his mother got custody. His father became dissatisfied, leaving Los Angeles.
Holy shit, this is some serious nonsense.
Angeles for Arizona. His mother raised him by herself. Eldridge has one sister who became a hyper-leftist, as was normal for girls in her demographic and age. She got a useless degree and works as a barista, channeling her rage into politics.
I can't.
His mother got stressed at working and supporting the children at the same time. She would go years with certain mild substance abuse, like smoking tobacco or alcohol, without it taking over her life. She would also have various boyfriends that never stayed and didn't really have any interest in being a stepdad. There's an important anthropological detail here. Through studies, we found that family structure is incredibly important given that it imprints what seems intuitively correct onto people. This is an example of Saw, in that Confucius said the same thing, where he said that family is the basis of national or civilizational unity and stability. Thus,
well, not quite. The thing is that you can have multiple family structures. What matters more is a sense of stability. It's a sense of stability. So, like, your ability to see what's intuitively right and normal should be built around stable. You can have a single-parent household in which a person is well raised. They don't necessarily develop problems. So, the structure of the family is far less important than that structure provides stability. And this is a much more complicated relationship. There are incentives that societies put out, like there are tax incentives for how families are structured. There are welfare incentives for how families are structured. The way in which you help provide stability can be changed by your government. So, like, the argument that one of these is superior to the other isn't really based on anything that's factual or correct. It's based on a set of interpretations of and a set of assumptions built into the society in question.
by stabilizing the family, you stabilize the society. You can use family structure to predict the political ideology of a society or its level of development. The role fathers have in a society predicts how societies see God or the government. Without a father in his life, as well as going to a feminized school, Tom always felt like he wasn't really a man. His mother...
A feminized school. What is a feminized... Guys, is there such a thing as a feminized school? I didn't know that was a thing.
Loved him, but would get stressed over minor stuff, didn't understand his desire to be great or change the world, and would periodically act incredibly irrationally. Tom always wanted to do stuff with his life, but he had trouble having personal discipline and responsibility. We know from studies that fathers imprint the ability to feel like you have agency in the world, while mothers imprint psychological stability or mindfulness. Fatherless homes...
Well, here's the problem with that, is that you can get into situations in which you have a fatherless home that someone, the mother steps up and imprints those concepts on people. These things are not universal. This is built on unwarranted assumptions. We're not watching all this, by the way, because holy shit.
Are vastly worse off than those with a dad. 90% of runaways don't have a dad. 80% of rapists. 63% of youth suicides. Vastly.
Sources. Wait, sources. I have a really hard time believing this. Like, okay, let's just take the rapist one. The problem with that is that rape is an incredibly pernicious thing that exists almost anywhere. Plenty of people are perform sexual assault and rape. Like, what on earth? Where in the fuck did he get these numbers from? Sources.
Higher drug usage. 85% of childhood disorders.
National Fatherhood Initiative. Let's look at this. Where does this show? None of that is shown by this here. Like, what?
Teen girls from fatherless homes are 3 times as likely to get pregnant out of wedlock. This stuff is a really...
That's not what it says. It says 7.
Big deal, and I can't understate it. The horrible thing is that nearly... This stuff is a really big deal, and I can't understate it.
Oh, you little shit. When you remove fathers, the kind of things you need to bleep out of YouTube videos occur. One in 4. Resting, like, okay. Let us assume 1 in 4. Yeah, well, yeah, you're absolutely right, TK. A bad father can be present as well. 1 in 4 homes don't have a father. So you trying to argue as a proportion of your viewership, just over 500,000 of a 300 million person country, that you managed to get all of the fatherless kids, all the fatherless men in one place?
Higher drug usage, 85% of childhood disorders. Teen girls from fatherless homes are 3 times as likely to get pregnant out of wedlock. This stuff...
None of them got pregnant with you, which is why we're forced to watch this video.
Stuff is a really big deal, and I can't understate it. The horrible thing is that nearly half of American children live in a fatherless home, and for certain ethnic or racial...
No, not half of American children. Quarter. I found that out with a Google search.
groups, this gets...
See, that's why you can't have gay marriage, because those kids would get 2 fathers if they got adopted, and that's just not fair.
Up to 3/4 of the population, making this a national epidemic, and this is happening...
This is a fan fiction. Like, he's having a fan fiction
at the worst rates ever in human history now. In leaving Indiana, Tom's family is isolated. His mother is incredibly stressed that she has to support her children while working a full-time job with little support. She has 2 girlfriends that she sees once a month where they have a wine night, but neither are the kind of people that she can really expect to reliably support her in the hard times of her life. She went through a depressive episode after Tom left that she didn't tell anyone about until a year later. Keep in mind...
Okay, it sounds like your mother's having some trouble. Maybe you should call her waterfaultist.
Saw has consistently shown that interpersonal relationships are the most important driving variable for happiness. Due to the stress of this,
This isn't ancient wisdom. This is fairly basic human behavior. Yes, your interpersonal relationships affect how you're. Oh God.
Mother would periodically collapse into hysteria when she became too stressed. She would be obsessed with completely inane details. She was a borderline helicopter parent, but not nearly the worst that Tom knew, especially growing up in suburban California. His mother would get very worked up over minor details like getting his school lunch perfectly right, and whenever he would stay with friends, she would call multiple times to make sure he was okay. From this, Tom has a sense of inner rage at never being able to develop his masculinity by doing brave stuff as a child. As an adult, he feels like he has potential which was never tapped. Keep in mind, I'm 2 years younger than Tom. The stories I have about helicopter parenting are absolutely horrifying. My parents were on the other side of the spectrum, where they let me do whatever I wanted, not really out of any principle, mind you, they just didn't care. However, growing up, I knew parents who wouldn't let their kids get out of their sight until age 18, who would walk their kids 4 blocks to school, or wouldn't let them spend their own money until the end of high school, who would move to the state their children went to college in to follow them there, who would read all their texts, not let them play outside or leave the house, or even do stuff like play violent video games or study war. I think this is legitimately evil. That's since the parents threw
No more, no mas. This is a fantasy from a very upset little boy. Let's find something else. Let's see. I have a big list of things. No mas. Ooh, let's do this. I saw this and got interested. We're going to watch this instead. Now I'm going into this one blind, so...
In the early 1800s, Sir Richard Colt Hall made the very journey that I've just made now to come and have a look at what's just behind the camera and just here through this hedge. I'm going to have a look at this. Now this is Bury Hill Fort, really impressive hill fort, hidden in all the trees here in northwest Hampshire. So it's not very famous even to the locals, but that wasn't always the case. Sir Richard Colt Hall painted a picture of Sir Edmund Ironside battling from this fort against Canute, who positioned himself across the valley at Bulkesbury Hill. So with a fair degree of confidence we can say that didn't happen, or at least there is no evidence of it happening. But the evidence that was found here for the past and the history of Bury Hill Fort was so much more compelling, and it told us so much more about the history here, much more than Sir Richard Colt Hall himself could have ever imagined. In the heart of these ancient landscapes, we're surrounded by these enigmatic remnants of hill forts. I wanted to tell their story. My journey began with a simple perception, an image of these fortresses as mere bastions of Iron Age life. I imagined nothing but a place of dwelling, and yet when I delved deeper, that veil of simplicity lifted, and it revealed a story that I'd never considered, a far richer and more complex narrative. These hill forts held roles and secrets far beyond mere habitation. These hill forts have stood here for over 2,500 years, and today I want to share with you what I've learnt, just by scratching the surface, and how that's changed my perception of the landscape forever. So ahead of me lies Danebury Hill Fort here in the south of England, part of the Balgai tribe, and we know where they existed because of the coinage found, and that allows you to give a broad map of their territory. And we also know more recently that they had a king at one point, Eustenertos, because that was found on a coin typical of the Balgai tribe. Danebury was remodelled over the 500 years it was occupied a few times. In fact, at its height there were over 400 people living within its ramparted walls. We now know that it had a king, a temple, farmsteads all around it. This place really conformed to everything that I perceived a hill fort to be. Danebury really is quite the spectacular sight. Now, growing up in this area as a kid, let me show you something.
Please do.
Now, growing up in this area, we had the local Iron Age Museum, wonderful place, and it would teach us about this site and all the workings that Barry Cunliffe did here in the 80s. And it taught us that was the hill fort, that was everything, the be all and end all of hill forts. But then I always wondered about that. Now, you might not be able to see what I'm pointing at, but I'm pointing at Bury Hill Fort, less than 4 miles away from here. Now, Danebury was surrounded in farmsteads along the river banks, all supplying into the community's many grain storage pits, all found within the ramparted walls.
Well, it makes a certain amount of sense, right? These were sort of cities, such as they were, right? What is 10 scare? It's Nuke's Top 5 channel.
So what about back here at Bury? Do we have just another occupation site, a group of people living here? We would expect them to be of the same tribe because we're so close to Danebury. Well, it turned out it was neither a rival tribe or the same. It turned out there was no human occupation here whatsoever. It turned out what was here was a lot more compelling. I've just found probably one of the gated entrances of this hill fort, and the ramparts there are absolutely huge, the earthworks that still remain. Now, the finds that came from here were very centred around equine finds, horse bits, horse harnesses and chariot fittings. Now, 50% of the animal bones found here, well, they too were of a horse variety. It really feels like this place had a very specific purpose. Based upon the approximate age of the death of the horses found in the bones, well, they were not reared for meat. The emphasis was on the horse riding and chariots. This activity dated to late Iron Age, perhaps when the threat of the Romans was high on the agenda. This feels very much like an organised society. This struck me as absolutely fascinating that an industrial site was here. This hill fort was being used to produce all the equine needs for the local tribe, hugely well defended, and the tribe obviously being those across the way up at Danebury. This was their production facility for all of their equine needs. Caesar was very clear in his...
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily too far out of the question. Particularly because it would make a certain amount of sense, particularly for horses, that you would have a different area for blacksmithing and farrieing.
Writings that the tribes of Britain used chariots in a very intimidating way to throw their opponents' ranks into disorder. So hill forts weren't just about occupation and providing a home for the local tribe. It seems like there's a bit more to it. Okay, just up ahead is Figsbury Rings. Now, before I show you it in person, have a look at this drawing from William Stukely. He came here in 1723 and drew the landscape in a very William Stukely type way. The most important thing for Stukely was the position in the landscape. He marked on his drawing Old Sarum, New Sarum, the Clarendon Park, a Roman road. Stukely conjectured a lot about this site. Now, the site itself is not only windy, but it's also really fascinating because you think hill fort, classic rampart, bank structures all around the outside. Now, when Maud and Ben Cunningham came here to excavate in the 1930s, well, they described the inner part as a henge. They suggested it was probably late Neolithic. It had very sharply cut edges and they described it as V-shaped. No timber, no stone was found here, and they suggested it could be a causeway enclosure. Either way, perfectly concentric, we have maybe over 1,500 years later the remains of a univalent Iron Age hill fort, 800 to 500 BC. And what's interesting about both eras, that we have no evidence to date of occupation. No one lived here, but that wasn't always believed to be the case. A little bit of shelter from the wind in the Neolithic ditch. The site here was commonly known back in the antiquarian era as Courteous, because a lot of those...
Yeah, the concept of the ditch obviously is a really useful fortification, though. Like, marking out an area to keep other things at with ditches is probably the simplest and easiest set of fortifications you could do, particularly in the Iron Age.
Those antiquarians believed that this place was occupied by the Romans right here in the 4th century. More specifically, Constantine Claudius, who came here to crush a rebellion in the 4th century. Now, he may well have came and crushed a rebellion, I've no idea, but there's certainly no evidence here of Roman occupation, despite the fact there was a firmly held belief for probably a century or more. Now, William Stukely suggested that this lesser camp, well, it was enlarged by the Romans, he said, and they took the earth from this ditch here and put it on the banks that we see today. That was how they were built up to look like what they look like now. Now, I don't want to sort of mock Stukely for his conjecture there and how badly he got it wrong, because I think he did get something right. If we stand on the rampart there, the Iron Age rampart, you'll see exactly what I mean. And that was the view. And I don't think it was just the view that he was drawing when he depicted these ancient sites. I think it was the significance of that site in relation to the landscape. He almost drew it like a drone shot, slightly from above. And it allowed us to see Old Sarum, New Sarum, Roman roads, everything there that would have been potentially important to him at the time. And maybe as we go back through time, those as well. The henge probably couldn't be seen from down in the valleys there, but certainly from the henge you have the significance of the sites that lay in front of us.
I would be very careful of taking a 1930s archaeologist drawing and ascribing previous, that would be risky, previous importance to it.
Maybe Stukely was onto something. This is the really spectacular Badbury Rings. On the maps, as with many of the hill forts that we've seen today, it states fort. And that's okay, because look at this significance of these ramparts here, the banks and the ditches, and there's 3 rings of them as far as I can tell. Now, there hasn't been a lot of excavations here, largely owing to its relatively recent purchase by the current owners. Martin Papworth dug here and suggested that there was potential for a number of round huts. It wasn't hugely convincing, but he suggested occupation for a short time, late Iron Age, and he also suggested that this wasn't seen as a principal settlement. So here at Badbury, we're well inside the territory of the Durotriges, the tribe that were here long before the Romans during the Iron Age. Now, Martin's theory was that the Durotriges had abandoned this particular hill fort in favour of a settlement down in the valley near Shapwick. That ties in really well with the Danebury theory that it was abandoned 100 to 50 BC, a good 100 years before the Romans arrived. In fact, Barry Cunliffe suggested that without exception he has seen no evidence of continued use past that period. So whatever age this did take shape, whatever period during the Iron Age it was constructed for, and whatever its reasons at the moment, well, we don't know. But there is one more really important aspect to consider with this hill fort. Now, David Jardine, in his book, the hill forts of the Stour Valley makes a really interesting point. He suggests that this was one of part of a route, so one hill fort of about 6 that made up a route from inland all the way down to the Hengistbury Head, potentially an Iron Age port. Now that changes things quite significantly. Badbury Rings remains a mystery. More archaeology will of course help us one day unveil its secrets, but for the time being we have a short-lived occupation, maybe part of a route.
Well, as long as there's no major water loss underneath it, I suspect those hills would hold up. Groundwater caverns to pull them down or apart, and there's nothing to erode anything else. They probably should hold up for ever.
Above all, an incredibly beautiful spot. Mortimer and Tess Wheeler came to Dorset in the 1930s. They had an agenda. They wanted archaeology to be on the map, and rightly so. They dug extensively at Maiden Castle and pretty quickly came up to the conclusion that the Romans invaded in 43 AD and took the hill forts of Great Britain in some gruesome and bloody battles. For extensive work from the likes of Sharples and Miles Russells, well, we know that wasn't the case. You see, when the Romans did arrive here, it's likely, certainly in this part of the country, the Durotriges tribe-defined area, that they'd have found things looking pretty much like they were today. Small farmsteads scattered about, no one really occupying the hill forts in a major defended way. Perhaps, as I say, in a small farmstead way, but nothing like their dark past. That brings me nicely to here. This is Hod Hill, huge Iron Age hill fort built around 500 BC, give or take, and it sits just to the south of Hambledon Hill, just across the valley there. Now, this hill fort in particular has got something else special. It's really worth us considering on today's journey. Come and take a look at this. I'm not sure how well it will come out, but this inside the hill fort, that's a Roman wall. This is the, I guess it's called the, is it the vellum? The gap on the other side of the wall. So that there was part of a Roman fort which sat in around about a quarter of this hill fort. Now it was occupied from almost immediately from when the Romans invaded, 43 AD, for around about 5 or 6 years before it was abandoned. And what's hugely interesting here is the same story stuck with Maiden Castle. Roman ballista were found surrounding the Iron Age chieftain huts. 2 huge huts surrounded by an enclosure. The conclusion was made that these ballista had been fired at the chieftains in the last stand against the Romans. Turns out that it was far more likely that the Romans just used that specific area for target practice. The Roman invasion in this part of the country, this tribal area, was probably one that didn't cause that much bloodshed. So here at Hod, we have one of the hill forts that formed part of that.
Which is why you don't necessarily take archaeologists at face value, because sometimes they just make shit up.
Conjectured line by Jardine from Hambledon there to Hod here on down to Hengistbury. Could this really have formed part of that route and made up a safe trade route or a safe route just for travel of whatever thought you were looking to do? I'm not quite sure I'd want to make the journey from there down the hill and back up the hill over such a short period, but I do like the notion nonetheless. Hambledon that sits above us forms the first, the Hod, Spetsbury, Busbury, Badbury, and finally the port at Hengistbury. Now when we look at the routes across the Ridgeway, for example, we often see sites that are more akin to trading centres, marketplaces, rather than a route of absolute settlements. Perhaps we have the same here on a smaller scale. Up here on Hambledon, well, it might help to look back a little bit further in time. Also, it's quite spectacular. You see, so many of the hill forts we see today sit on top of or are surrounded by much older sites, sometimes Bronze Age, sometimes later.
So not very coherently done. My disappointment is immeasurable. is all right, but just not coherently put together. With that, I am going to retire before my back kills me. I want to wish everyone else a good night. We're going to get back to a much more aggressive schedule going forward, so stay tuned for all of that.